Hello and welcome to this Might and Co video on metacognition. And we are with the wonderful Anoara Mughal, who is going to be talking to us about all things metacognition. Anoara is a real expert in this field, and you only have to look at her list of accolades to know how much she's contributed to the field of metacognition over the years. She's an experienced teacher and leader and a primary specialist. She's been involved with Women Ed London. She has engagement with the Chartered College of Teaching. She founded New to SLT Chats on Twitter, as it was called then, to support others going into the profession. She's also published a book. The book Think Metacognition Powered Primary Teaching is available for you to peruse if you so wish after this episode. So that's quite a long list of accolades. I've introduced you, but what do we need to know about you and your journey? How have you got to where you've got to?
Thank you for the lovely introduction, Benny. I'm absolutely delighted to be here, and it's a real honor talking to you about my passion, metacognition. Um, so, my journey, having reflected on it quite recently, actually, um, my journey actually started as a teenager, um, and I wasn't aware at the time, but I used to. Be able to connect prior learning to new learning quite naturally. And I used to be able to learn like new skills and um, I not used to be able to, but I still can learn new skills and knowledge quite easily by making those all important connections. Um, and when I was a teenager, I was able to learn to read in different languages because I used to be able to see patterns and connect them. So this was a skill that I didn't recognize in my teenage years, but I think I've always been fascinated by it. When I went to university, I started learning about how the brain works, so the neurology side of things. And later on, I started delving into cognitive psychology as my learning progressed further. Um, and then when I went into teaching, I did go into teaching quite late. Later on in life, it was when I was actually moved from year one to year six that really propelled my thinking and learning even further. And I really started to research about, well, how do we as human beings learn? What are like the fundamentals? What are the concepts? What are the most important aspects of our learning? How do we think? And I really started researching then. Um, and I've been a teacher now for 16 years. And it was towards the end of my 16 years that I really started researching. I put in the book proposal. I've been fascinated by my whole life, really. And I continue to work with schools currently, developing their metacognitive practices. So, yes, that's been my journey, I guess.
And I love the fact that you have started that journey in your own childhood. And I think so much of how we learn um, influences how we teach. And
Yes.
so the fact that you kind of noticed those patterns and those abilities and tried to pick out the neuroscience, the cognitive science that goes behind that, I think is a testament to actually how we should be thinking about teaching. How do we learn as human beings? So for those people who are more unfamiliar with the term metacognition, how would you define it for the general population?
So, when you Google the word metacognition, it always comes up with thinking about thinking.
Mm,
But I think that is a very simplified version. There is no agreed definition of it. Psychologists haven't agreed on a definition. But I think if we pick out the important elements of it, so metacognition involves having an awareness of our own learning and thinking processes, where it's more of like a critical examination of it.
mm,
Um, and really delving into, well, how do we become aware of that thinking process? What needs to be done to develop that? Um, but it relates to our cognitive potential as well. So thinking of it not as separate entities, but thinking of it together.
Mm,
How do we use metacognition to develop our own awarenesses of our cognitive potential?
mm.
And how do we critically examine those?
Yeah, that's a really interesting definition because certainly I think some of the misconceptions out there about metacognition is it is about thinking styles and, learning to learn. And those kind of don't really encompass the breadth that goes into the metacognitive field. Have you seen people kind of mistaking metacognition for those kind of more, I suppose, fad-like activities?
I have, but I think part of the problem with that is teachers are time poor. So they might see something on the internet or they might hear a conversation and they think that that one element is metacognition on its own.
Mm,
Um, and we need to have more of like a nuanced, more research-based approach to it because it is very complex
mm,
and there are lots of concepts that actually make up the entire metacognitive skills processes. So there is a lot more to it. And also, I think the other issue is when we think about thinking, we think, well, we all think, there's nothing more to it.
mm.
Um, and we think that we are teaching it explicitly, but perhaps we need to be a bit more explicit about it.
I definitely think that's true. And we know that there are some really good extended learning courses on metacognition. I know a lot of research schools will often focus on metacognition. But in your experience with your teachers and people that you've worked with, what's the best way to really explore metacognition as a concept in the classroom for staff who are looking to implement it?
So I would say the best way is to start thinking about the definitions of metacognition first of all, and use that as a basis to explore all the other concepts because it involves quite a lot of processes and steps. So, for example, the metacognitive cycle is the main one, which involves the process of connecting ideas, planning, monitoring, and evaluating your thinking processes when you're learning a task, for example. Now, that needs to be unpicked. Well, what does each stage mean? And how can you teach each stage explicitly?
Mm,
But also, what does it actually look like in the classroom? What will you see learners doing when they are planning, when they are monitoring their thinking? What would you expect to see during those parts of the cycle? And really relating it to um, classroom practice. And it can sound a little bit, um, dare I use the term airy fairy, it
mm,
can sound a little bit like that. But actually, when you unpick what it is, you will be able to see the strategies that you are currently using and the strategies that you could develop further.
mm, mm. And so
But
do
it does
teach.
it,
Oh, sorry.
sorry, it is something that does need to be unpicked in detail.
Yeah. And I was thinking for most teachers who have a kind of surface view of metacognition, it might come back down to activities, things that you do in the
Yes,
classroom. But what I'm hearing is actually there is a kind of academic side to this, a scientific side to this, that if we're starting to explore metacognition, we really have to have an awareness of the underlying and underpinning
principles.
principles of
Yes,
it. Yeah, absolutely. So, I would say one of the places to start would be your book, obviously.
yes.
Where else would teachers go to really start thinking about this? Where should they be engaging with metacognition? Who's doing the work?
So the work has really taken off in the last few years,
Mm,
even more so since the pandemic as well.
mm,
So I would suggest starting with the book, looking at the references at the back. When I started writing the book, I looked at the EEF
mm,
guidance on metacognition, self-regulated learning. Again, that is a great starting point, and there's lots of references at the back for further reading.
mm,
So that would be another go-to. Um, Networking with the research schools is another great idea as well.
mm, mm,
And recently, there has been, um, sorry, let me just start again. So
mm,
recently, um, there have been newer books being published on metacognition. I mean, mine was published in 2021,
mm.
but I am aware of newer books being written. So keep a lookout for those as well, I would say.
Yeah, definitely. And the work of the EEF, the Education Endowment Foundation, has really propelled metacognition to the
Yes.
space because we talk about effect size um, and how much impact metacognition or being aware of metacognitive skills, learning metacognitive skills can have. So staff become aware, can become aware of the what it is part of it.
Mhm.
Um, what do you know about the impact of it? What are we saying for our young people? Why is this important?
I would say it's crucial at the moment. Again, particularly due to the effects of the pandemic,
Mm,
where a lot of learning gaps have been created because of it. Um, I've seen it really, really accelerate progress in learning
mm,
in children. Um, and the EF say that children can progress by 7 months.
mm,
In some occasions, I've seen a larger progress range than that.
mm,
Um, so it is really, really important. But also, um, we need to think about, the whole well-being aspect of learning and teaching, um, and all the mental health issues at the current, sorry, all the mental health issues that we're currently facing. Um, it is a crucial time to really hone in on our metacognitive skills and strategies.
mm.
Um, yeah, sorry.
No, no, no. I absolutely take your point. And I think, this idea of impact, we think about it in numbers or months, but there's a kind of personal impact for young people where they feel more comfortable in learning. They feel more, they can access the learning in a more coherent way. And I'm interested in you were talking about kind of having that criticality, the understanding of
Mhm.
how the brain processes information. Now, I'm conscious that we're talking about this from a primary perspective. So, what does metacognition or teaching metacognition or metacognitive activities look like in the primary classroom?
Yes, so in the primary classroom, um, it's about developing that self-awareness, self-regulation, and there are various approaches that you can take to do this. So, the direct approach would involve explicit teaching of metacognitive skills and strategies, um, teacher modeling, out there thinking loudly, so think alouds, using think alouds, developing reflective processes as well. That's really important. So, for example, at the end of a lesson, you could ask a number of questions. So, for example, um, how did you get on with that task? What did you find easy? What did
Mm,
you find a bit more challenging? What would you do next time? Um, and then allowing spaces for open dialogue and like peer discussions. So where children can really discuss their reflective processes or their learning journeys as well, maybe even recording it. So primary schools do tend to use more kind of like floor book type um, tasks.
mm,
So children can, for example, learn a new skill and then reflect upon that, write sentences, even draw diagrams in a floor book. And I think all those things are a way of developing those all important metacognitive strategies. There are many, many more,
mm, mm,
um, obviously, but developing that metacognition also, by the time they get to secondary school, um, becoming more independent and more confident in their learning, that can then help them in the next stage of their academic progress as well. So I think it's really, really vital to develop that independency
mm,
at
mm.
primary school.
Yeah, and it sounds to me like you're um, talking about quite simple things actually, in
Hmm.
the sense that we can get carried away with, fancy titles, but what we're really doing is checking in on how the learning has landed with young people. Just that question, how did that go for you? Um,
Yes.
do you find that children of that age have the vocabulary to talk about the learning process, or is that something that needs to be taught?
Um, I think it depends. It depends on their learning journey. I mean, certainly, like, um, children are able to say how they feel about a task at a very young age. I mean, I've seen children at age 3, 4 who they may not necessarily have the language, but they have that thought process going on, and they
Mm,
may not be able to explain explicitly about their learning journey, but they'll perform the actions
mm, mm,
like prior to actually being able to explain it. So I think there is room for developing that vocabulary early on as
mm,
well. I've got an example in the book where I saw a 4-year-old child in the garden one day balancing a bicycle on the garden table.
mhm,
And this child would get on the bicycle, ride, fall off, get back on it, ride a bit further, fall off. And he did this continuously. And then he'd go back to the beginning, balance his bicycle again, and continue. And it was several weeks later where I saw this child with his parents. And I asked him, I said, so how did you no, I saw him actually on the bicycle without stabilizers and he was riding. And I think this
right.
was about a month
Yeah.
afterwards. And I said, how did you learn to ride a bicycle? And all he said to me was, I just practiced and practiced and practiced. And he was only 4 years old at that time. So that got me thinking, first of all, how did he know how to do that? He
Mm,
had limited vocabulary, but he was starting to put this process in action.
mm, mm.
So that was really fascinating.
Yeah, it is, isn't it? And I'm a parent and I've worked in schools, and watching children of that age go through the learning process is so revealing about how learning happens. And there was something very simple yet effective about his approach. That
Yes.
he knew that he couldn't do something, so he was going to try again. And we often say, try again.
Hmm.
Um, but the fact that he had that term, practice, I
Yes.
practiced. Potentially that's a word that's been used around him.
Hmm.
Um, and he's absorbed that. And that's metacognition without even thinking about the criticality of it. So for teachers, how do they leverage that? How do they take the ability of a 4-year-old to go through a learning process and cash in on that? Is it something that's deliberate or is it something that's more organic? Is it planned into units of work? What does that look like to you?
So to me, in order to take that child like forward, I would then um, give that child the vocabulary that he needs in order to explain his thinking processes.
Mm,
So, um, why did you balance the bicycle on the table? Maybe give them sentence openers
mm,
um, to start their process of verbalizing the thinking
mm,
effectively. And then, after finding out their reasons for doing what they did, can they put that learning into effect into a different domain?
mm,
So can they use that thinking process, for example, to solve a maths problem
mm. That
or,
connection. Yeah.
yes, making the connections?
Yeah, yeah. And that I think is key, isn't it? That,
Yes.
take something that's very natural, comes very naturally, but to make them aware of the thinking. And the term metacognition is defined in that, isn't it? To
Yes.
make you aware of the thinking that you've done so you can apply it elsewhere.
Hmm.
Um, So, in some ways, I think it's always helpful to think about lethal mutations. When something comes into the field um, of teaching and is popularized, you'll often see lethal mutations.
Mhm.
So, have you seen any examples of activities that are not metacognition, that are simply just kind of mistaking the concept?
So I've seen a few. As I mentioned earlier, because teachers are time poor,
Mm,
they may see a um, thought or they may see a discussion or something
mm,
and mistakenly think that that is metacognition. So I've
mm,
seen, for example, um, people thinking that by creating awe and wonder, which is part of metacognition, that's it. We've done it. We've
mm,
engaged the students, and that's it. We don't need to do anything more.
mm, mm,
But actually, um, this is the reason why it should be delved deeper into, and
mm,
more research needs to be done. The flip side of it is, I've seen occasions whereby the whole thing about the direct approach to teaching or explicit teaching,
mm,
um, some people think, right, if I teach everything explicitly, that is it.
mm, mm,
That is metacognition done in a nutshell. The flip side of that, however, and I have also seen this, is students then become over reliant
mm, mm.
on explicit teaching,
Yeah, yeah.
and that can then hinder independence
Mm, mm,
and developing their own thinking process, which is why I think it's really, really important to have the inquiry approach to combine it with that as well. So that's obviously up to the teacher and the
mm,
school
mm,
as to when and where that happens. But more creating more problem solving opportunities, more kind of inquiry based approaches to teaching
mm, mm.
would be beneficial. And then
Yeah.
that would, because you have to allow the brain that space, not only to make the connections, but also to develop conceptual thinking.
Mm, mm.
And if you're always being taught explicitly, it hinders that process.
Yeah, it's
So
really
it's about
interesting.
balance.
Yeah, really interesting to hear you say that balance needed and that ability to conceptualize requires the ability to discuss, to
Yes.
process. And quite often if you're just told things, it doesn't happen that way. And certainly in my career, we have had metacognitive drives
Mhm.
where children are taught about how the brain retains information, the memory cycle, that kind of thing. I mean, how early can you start going into some of these conversations with little ones? Is there a too early?
Um, it's not too early to discuss how we feel about our learning,
Mm,
what can we improve on our learning, what steps do we need to take, or even thinking. So, for example, I am thinking about this. That's not too
mm,
early. Um, However, so that can be started like early as like nursery,
mm, mm,
and then explicitly teaching about the metacognitive cycle. That would be like stage three. So I always think of it in terms of stages rather than
right.
ages.
Mm,
So stage one is where you start developing um, the emotional vocabulary. So how do I feel about this? Stage two would then go into more of the reflective vocabulary. So um, I tried this, but it didn't work. What can I do next time?
mhm,
And then I would say stage three is then focusing on that planning, monitoring, evaluating, connecting cycle.
right.
Although I have to admit, connections can start early on.
Mm, mm,
Um, but then delving deep into the practice of planning, monitoring, and evaluating will
mm,
be stage three. And then developing that further and more explicitly would be stage four. So
right. Okay.
really critically thinking
Yeah, yeah.
about the learning would be stage four.
That's a really nice flow. and the idea that you start with the kind of personal response, the feeling, and then move, I suppose, scaffold up into thoughts about the kind of critical processes that are going on. And I think for practitioners, I think it's nice to have that. You know,
hmm
it doesn't have to be complicated. It can be part and parcel of conversations that are being held in the classroom naturally,
hmm
as opposed to we need to do a lesson on this X, Y, and Z.
Yes. And
Um,
you don't need any fancy equipment, and
yeah, yeah,
it just naturally fits into the teaching process.
yeah, absolutely. Um, is this something we share with parents?
Absolutely. So, more recently, a number of parents have come across my book and they're really fascinated
Okay.
by the area of metacognition.
Mm.
And I do have a new website. I'm going to
Of
do a
course.
shameless plug. It's called Think, Future, Learn. And some parents have accessed it and they're
Yeah,
asking me, they're requesting a parent section
that's interesting.
where they would like to know not only more about metacognition, but how to help their children. So yes, this is my new project that I'm working on at the moment. That is my new website as well. Sorry. Um,
No, it's important because I think, when you're providing resources for the wider community, as you have done for a long time, it's important to know well where people can get access to that, and that will be as part of the resources. But that's fascinating that parents are asking how to use metacognition or how to leverage it to help their young people. Have you
yes.
had any stories about them using the strategies and how that's impacted on them?
Yes, so I have been working with a few families over
Yeah.
the last academic year, and I've actually given them my some of the resources that I've made. So I've made like little bookmarks and things
Mm,
like that for pupils to use whilst they're studying. So I remember a parent saying to me, "Oh, thank you so much for that reading bookmark," where it had a list of reading metacognitive strategies. And as a result, their child has progressed quite significantly over the year. And the parents been really, really impressed by it. So,
yeah, but that's lovely joined up work, isn't it? You can't
yes,
beat that cycle of I teach in a particular way, have certain conversations, the child engages, but also gets that message reinforced at home.
yes.
And the prompts, being consistent, consistency we always say is so important, isn't it? Have you had any pushback? Has anyone said we shouldn't be doing this with children?
No, no pushback anywhere,
Mhm.
not in the schools I've delivered training sessions in, not with parents. Everyone's really fascinated by it,
Mm-mm,
and they want to learn more. I guess because metacognition is really about ourselves, isn't it?
mm-mm.
Um,
Yeah, definitely. And when I was looking at it and doing the research, you can't help but reflect on your own processes,
yes.
um, and just become more aware of who you are in that kind of learning space.
hmm
I wonder actually, there seems to be a natural fit for metacognition in the primary phase,
hmm
particularly around those younger children and how they feel. Um, is it something that gets lost in transition to secondary?
Possibly. Maybe the emphasis shifts
Mm,
somehow. Um, Also, in primary school, in a way, it is much easier to make the connections
mm,
between different domains of learning and different subjects
mm,
as well, because primary school teachers tend to have one teacher for a
mm.
whole academic year,
Yeah, of
and that
course.
one teacher teaches a range of subjects. So it is easier to develop metacognitive skills um, in different areas of learning.
Mm,
But I guess by the time children get to secondary school, it must become a bit of a challenge because teachers tend to teach one subject, so they're
mm.
not necessarily aware of what someone else is teaching. So it must be
Yeah.
quite a challenge to make those connections.
Yeah, and I wonder actually if, say for example, a local feeder school had done lots of work on metacognition, whether that is, not it's seen as something that happened at primary school. It doesn't need to happen in secondary.
hmm
Um, and I think perhaps actually we're not necessarily doing that joined up thinking. We'll do transition as to how to manage your first day, your
hmm
first week, but actually the thinking transition, that's
Yes,
an interesting one, I think.
that is.
Yeah. I just wanted to go back to what you want to say about that domains of learning and
hmm
crossing it. Um, that I can see how you've taken an example of the bike, for example.
hmm
That is a very physical activity. And I'm trying to work out what that would look like in maths.
hmm
Um, is it just a case of saying, well, he practiced and he practiced, he just needs to practice, practice, practice in maths?
No, there's more to it. So,
Okay.
when you delve into the reasons why, so the purpose, the reasons why that child wanted to learn how to ride the bike,
Mm,
that will give you an insight into their thinking.
mm,
So why did you want to learn to ride the bike? It could be, oh, my big brother rides a bike, so I want to be like my big brother, for example. So if you relate that to a maths problem, well, why are we learning about maths?
mm,
Where does it fit into the bigger picture? What is the purpose of learning about, for example, fractions?
mm,
What is
mm,
the reason? What are you going to be able to do as a teenager, as an adult? When you learn about fractions, so it could be, I don't know, planning a birthday party.
mm,
Well,
mm,
yes, you would need knowledge of fractions in order to be able to do that.
mm,
So
mm,
it all starts with the purpose. And then, for example, how did you feel when you fell off the bike? In maths, for example, when they're solving a problem and they get really stuck because you've challenged them to that point where they do get stuck, created a little bit of desirable difficulty
yeah,
there.
yeah,
Um, so when you get stuck, how did you feel when you fell off the bike? Right, how are you feeling now that you're stuck doing this maths problem? Can you see the connections, the
yeah,
similarities?
yeah.
What did you do to overcome this when you were riding your bike? What did you think? What
Mm, mm.
actions did you take? And again, in maths, how are you going to overcome this obstacle now or this challenge?
Yeah, yeah, I can see that. Um, how to translate the frame, I suppose,
Mhm,
to between different subjects. And just while you were talking, it occurred to me that actually part of what we're talking about here is not just the skills or the qualities that you need to learn, but
mhm.
motivations as well, to kind of keep
Yes.
motivations as part of it. How would
Mhm.
you describe motivation as being part of this?
So motivation, again, we are at the early stages
Mm, mm,
um, of our thinking about motivation. There are lots and lots of schools of thoughts out there
mm, mm,
about human motivation. Um, but I would say motivation also comes from successes.
mm, mm,
So when your motivation levels are quite low, you can draw on the successes that you've already had.
mm,
So, I have seen children in schools who are, dare I say, dare I use the term,
mm.
repeat failures.
Mm, mm, mm,
And perhaps it hasn't been made explicit to them where they have been successful in
mm,
some kind of learning. So it could be because children don't often notice these things.
mm, mm,
So it could be that they can't do, for example, column addition,
mm,
but it could be that they have uh, a skill in intense concentration, for example.
mm.
Well, that is a success. So it's going back to reframing what successes look like. They don't have to
Yeah,
be academic.
yeah,
They
yeah.
could be pastoral successes.
Mm,
Today you were able to sit still for 5 minutes.
mm.
That is a success in itself.
Yeah,
So when motivation is dwindling, it's about drawing upon those successes. Well, yes, you have been successful in this area. So how do we become successful in another area as well?
I love
Um,
that.
yes, and also it's about getting those routines and habits,
Mm.
because motivation levels, as we're all aware, do vary.
Yeah.
Day to day, within a day, they vary. They're always going up and down. So, but if we are in good habits
Hmm.
and stick to routines, that can help overcome the times when we are at low levels of motivation as well.
Yeah. And it's that ability to kind of draw on um your memory of success
Yes.
if you are stuck. But it's also that kind of prompt that might be in the room
Yes.
about that. Um,
Absolutely.
I'm reminded while you were talking um to reference the work of Graham Nuttall, the Hidden Lives of Learners. And he off one of his conclusions was to predict a success rate in learning.
Yes.
One of the key factors is the behaviors, the academic
Hmm.
behaviors, the learning behaviors that you are able to demonstrate in chaos, in sometimes chaotic spaces.
Hmm.
Um, and so it strikes me that actually that's what it is. It's about giving them a set of learning behaviors that means that they're able to draw on those later.
Absolutely. And that is all part of metacognition.
Mm,
How do we enable the right behaviors, or
mm.
create the conditions for the right behaviors to develop, to enable that self-regulation
Yeah,
and
absolutely.
ultimately metacognition?
Yeah, and self-regulation, I think we've all seen it. We will
Mm.
often reference the child who is superb at self-regulation, and they'll often be general statements about they're going to be fine,
Yeah,
because they can self-regulate. And yet,
exactly.
where do we put the input in
Mhm.
to help them self-regulate?
Yes, because not all children can self-regulate naturally.
Mm, mm,
And by becoming more metacognitive, that can enable that self-regulation to develop.
mm. And while you were saying that, it occurred to me that there might be a conversation to be held here about students with additional needs.
Mhm.
Does metacognition suit children with particular needs? Is there a body of research around this?
I would say metacognition is one of the pedagogies that can leverage um, academic progress for those students as well.
Mm, mm,
Um, because send group of pupils, they may not necessarily, due to their, the numerous barriers that they have in their
mm, mm,
learning, they may not explicitly know what metacognition is.
mm,
And I believe that teaching it in detail, explicitly, particularly for those students,
mm,
can really leverage that academic
mm,
success and give them the necessary skills that they need.
mm,
It does become a kind of unconscious thing,
mm,
metacognition, for those that are more experienced learners.
mm.
And often they're not able to verbalize exactly their thinking processes because it's become unconscious.
Yeah.
So, for our students with additional needs, it does need to become explicit.
Mm, mm. But it's like you said at the beginning, isn't it? That you recognize now that your learning habits as a child
Mhm.
um, had metacognitive value,
Yes.
but perhaps actually had become unconscious throughout the years,
Mhm.
and it hadn't been explicit to you, but because you were a high quality learner, that was there. For some of our students who have either processing difficulties,
Mhm.
um, or kind of concentration difficulties, actually that framework I can see could be quite helpful. You know.
Absolutely. So it's
Mm,
like, for example, if I'm teaching a writing unit, I may have success criteria,
mm,
um, because often those students, because of various reasons, poor
mm,
working memory or processing difficulties, they've got a lot going on in their heads.
mm, mm,
So if the core learning of a particular lesson isn't about um, for example, memorizing what's on the success criteria. If the core
Mm,
learning is, I've got to develop using adjectives in my writing, for example,
yeah.
that is your learning objective. The objective is not something else. You can give pupils a list of success criteria of what they need to do. It could be process related, or
Mm,
it could be a list of ingredients of
mm, mm,
what is it that they need to include. So they don't need to memorize
mm,
what it
mm,
is that they need to do. So then that then alleviates some of that burden or worry from them, and they can solely concentrate on the skill that they're
mm.
developing.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think for us as teachers, to really kind of consider that range of needs in the
Mhm.
classroom and where metacognition would be particularly useful, is part of our role, I think, to take that individual, rather than the generic class, and try to move them all on at the same pace.
Absolutely.
Uh, have you worked with any schools that have really been beacons, of developing metacognition? Where are your bright spots?
Um, so that is a very interesting question. I've been working with schools more at the initial stages
Right.
of developing the metacognitive practices.
Mm.
So if there are any schools out there who are beacons, I haven't come across them yet. I'm sure there are.
Yeah,
Please get in touch because it will be lovely to see the other side as well. So
yeah,
I
yeah.
haven't been doing this for long. So yes, that will be absolutely brilliant.
Mm, mm. I think for me, it's about recognizing that, it takes sometimes years for good
Yes,
practice to develop, doesn't it?
absolutely.
And if you're working at early stages, you don't always see the best practice straight away.
Yes,
It's a lot like diversity,
yes.
we're not quite there yet with finding schools that are all singing and all
Mhm.
dancing. Um, so for you, if you had a group of teachers in front of you, and you were talking about, the most important things to know about metacognition in primary, what kind of takeaways would you leave them with?
So it's never too early to start that metacognitive journey. Um, Focus on the four stages of progression, um, and it can be taught more explicitly. Teachers are always using metacognitive strategies in their classrooms, and by providing training on metacognition, they will be able to see what their strengths are, what their areas for development are. Um, Also, collaborate with secondary schools.
Mm,
I've heard conversations or seen things on X um, about how difficult it is for secondary schools because from primary schools, children go out to lots and lots of different secondary schools.
yeah.
Everyone's got their own curriculum, different subjects that they teach. Um, and maybe children haven't learnt, I don't know, about I'm not sure quite what they
Yeah,
teach in
yeah.
secondary school. But say, for example, at secondary school, children are learning about the Romans, and
Yeah.
that hasn't been taught at primary school. Um, it is very difficult then for teachers to be able to start teaching a new subject at
Yeah,
secondary
yeah.
school. So I would say collaborate with secondary schools, and I don't think the focus should be, well, what are you teaching?
Mm, mm.
The focus should be how do we continue the thinking processes
Yeah.
and the thinking cycle from primary to secondary. So, for example, teachers should be discussing,
Mm,
um, okay, so this child is really good at the planning stage. So, setting goals, working out how long a task would take,
mm,
seeing it through to completion. However, this child, when it comes to the monitoring part of the cycle, which involves being able to adjust the strategies
mm,
if you get stuck, they're not very good at this stage of the learning
mm.
cycle. So, at secondary school, could you please focus on this side?
That's
So having
fascinating.
more conversations around that kind of
Yeah.
thing, as opposed to, you know, poor secondary schools being in a panic, thinking they haven't learned this. How are we going
Yeah.
to start it in year seven?
Oh my
So I think
goodness.
if we shifted that conversation,
Yeah.
there'd be huge progression.
Do
Um,
you know what? It's almost never occurred to me before that we could do that.
mm,
You know, it's you get so entrenched. I'm a secondary specialist, and I worked in an all through,
mhm,
and we never had that conversation. We talked about, um, the content. We talked about the content that
mhm,
moved from primary to secondary. Imagine getting a profile of a child that says, "This is what their thinking skills are like. This is what their processing skills are like." I can't imagine what I would have done with that information. That's almost blows my mind a little bit to think that we could, in theory,
we could.
create a learning profile like that.
Absolutely. How amazing would that be?
I
Oh
mean,
my God, it gives me
it'd be
goosebumps
fascinating.
thinking about
It's
it.
fascinating, and
It is.
the idea of that consistency of learning,
Mhm.
which we're always talking about the dip that happens between
Yes.
primary and secondary. Maybe
Yes.
that's where the dip is happening.
Maybe in the thinking skills.
Yeah, yeah.
Yeah.
I think there's scope then for teachers and leaders to do things slightly differently.
Mhm.
Um, but no, that those takeaways are really, really solid. And what I've really enjoyed about our conversation is actually there's a simplicity to it,
Mhm.
that we can get bogged down in the I suppose the neuroscience and the
Mhm.
cognitive, it's important to know that. But what it looks like in practice, those four stages,
Mhm.
makes it so clear for practitioners. And yeah, potentially a provocation around transition, and
Yes.
metacognition that I think people could take away and really run with. I want to say thank you because we've spent a little while talking, and I've just really enjoyed hearing your thoughts about it. And obviously, your extensive experience with young people really does shine through. The resources that you've mentioned, your website,
Mhm.
some of the books we've talked about, will be available as resource links as part of this video. So thank you for flagging those up. And hopefully we'll get to hear from you again at some point. So take care of yourself.
Thank you very much, Benny. I thoroughly enjoyed that.